Normally, when I stand on the stage, I'm talking about unemployment and inflation and productivity and wealth creation. And the economy is, of course, important to my heart, so I'm going to be talking about that today. But as William said, that I'd also be talking about something else that's very important to me. After all, I am human, and I do want to be happy. So, according to the Dalai Lama, the very purpose of life is actually happiness. So often we wonder, what are these economists all about? You know, this race for more growth, this race for more wealth. Well, in reality, I suppose the economy can deliver in terms of some of our happiness. If we think about it in terms of Maslow's, this pyramid that we're used to of 5 motivational needs, certainly economic growth has really helped to progress some of those most basic needs. So obviously, the more we grow, the better we can provide things like housing, health provision, security, a police force. But unfortunately, the economy can't deliver on everything that makes us happy. And you'll see in this chart as well that self-esteem, love, and the need to belong are actually a big part of happiness as well. So GDP is basically it's a vehicle for progression, but it can't deliver the ultimate goal. Now, even one of the founders of economic theory, the founder of the free market capital theory in economics, Adam Smith, he tells us in his theory of moral sentiments that actually acquiring more and more things doesn't actually make you happy. And this is, I think, one of the things that many of our young people are quite confused about at the moment. So the big house, and certainly teenagers these days, they get all these messages from social media about celebrity lifestyles, and they think that true happiness is about actually having this $1 million salary and getting the bigger house and having 6 Lamborghinis outside, and they think that is when you've actually made it. And if you just take a second and think about probably some of those flashy people in your life who have a lot of stuff that they like to show off, they're probably also the most dysfunctional people that you know as well. I better not say that too out loud. I live in Hollywood, a very flashy part of town. But ultimately, things don't actually make us happy, and it's trying to get that message across to children these days that it isn't about that, actually. There's a lot more to happiness than things. In fact, some of the fastest growing economies, the UK is one of the 5th largest economies in the world in terms of the happiness index. It ranks only number 23. The US isn't up there either, the world's largest economy. And it's quite hard to see these stats, but actually the little blue line, the block in the middle, represents hundreds of thousands of new cases of self-diagnosed work-related illness, which is stress, anxiety, and depression. Some of the facts are actually quite alarming around mental health across the UK. So in 2015, the total number of work days lost due to work-related stress, anxiety, and depression was actually accumulates up to 9.9 million. So people with this don't actually take a day off to recover on a Monday. This is something they take 3 months off, 6 months off, etc. What is most worrying, I think, if you look at some of these statistics around our young people, the number of young people aged between 15 and 16 with depression has actually doubled since I was a teenager in the 1980s. This is actually, it's so alarming. We have to stop and think about these statistics and think, what is going on? Young Minds, a charity that looks after the emotional well-being of young people, says that if the stats keep working as they're working and they see these trends, that they know by 2020, 100,000 children in the UK will be hospitalised for self-harm. So these are our kids, and we have to actually think, what is going on? Is this all just about economic growth, or should we be thinking about how we are looking at addressing these problems? Even boring old economists like me, as I say, we just want to be happy. And I have a friend in the audience, Helen, is here with us at some point. And Helen and I bumped into each other in the plane coming back from London recently. And she said to me, Helen, I should say as well, she won't mind me saying this, is a committed Christian. And I maybe don't go to church so much, and I'm glad my 81-year-old mother doesn't look at YouTube to see this, but, she said to me, Angela, are you happy? And I said, I am happy. And she said, but on a scale of 1 to 10? And I said to her, well, I think I'm actually about a 9 out of 10. Happiness is something that I work on, and I've probably been working on it since maybe my early 30s, and it's something that I do think about. And there's a number of ways that I personally get happy. So, for example, I read a lot about this, and I know that being grateful is one of the big things that helps to make you happy, actually being really grateful for what you've got. Not comparing yourself to other people, and I try and tell this to my kids, never do that. That's just a fool's game. There'll always be somebody in a better position, in a better job, who's got more things, who's younger, who's better looking, whatever. You'll always come off worse. So don't even try and compare yourself. Just be content with being the best that you are. Something I came across whenever I read Paulo Coelho, and I do like some of his stuff, but I'm not going to recommend you read it all because I don't like all of it. But one of the other things he said is to everyone you meet, treat them as a potential friend. And that for me was a wonderful bit of advice, because certainly in the business community, I would sit down at business lunches on a regular basis with total strangers. And it is really nice. You'd be so surprised at how interesting people are to the left and the right if you actually take time to get to know people and to get to know their story. And I think that was one of the best bits of advice that I've ever come across around happiness. And for me as well, it's silly things like just taking control of my own health. When you feel more in control, you feel happier. But of course, these are my rules and these are what works for me. But the good news is today that there is actually a new theory around happiness, which is really coming to the fore. It's very big in the United States, it's big in Australia, and it hasn't really taken off yet in the UK, but I promise you, I think if you were sitting here in 5 years' time, this new therapy, and it's called ACT, will be as in tune with today's audience as, say, for example, the growth in mindfulness that we know also helps to increase your happiness. So these books actually, and I'm going to try and give you a brief overview of what it's about today, and I'm not going to try and just say act happy because that works. Obviously, I'm not going to say that. This is called acceptance and commitment therapy, and it has been scientifically shown to really help people who have anxiety and who have depression and stress. And it's been made very simple by this psychotherapist, this doctor called Russ Harris. I have to be very careful how I say that, Russ Harris. And it's a worthwhile read, and I'm quite certain everybody in the audience will have come across a friend or a family member who does have anxiety, who does have stress. And I would, if nothing else comes from this talk, I hope you advise them to read these books. So what is acceptance and commitment theory? Well, it's really very basic actually, and what it is the acceptance part. Is you accept that actually life is not a bowl of cherries for everyone. And I think our kids today don't realise that. If you're living a full and meaningful life, you accept the ups and you accept the downs as well. And even the ups can have downs. So for example, somebody, maybe they've just gotten divorced and think, oh, I've no one to go home to in the evening, it's awful for me. Well, even people that are married, and I'm married myself, that's hard work too, because sometimes your partner, they would wreck your head. So there's downs with the ups as well. And I think it's about maybe this resilience, and I think Paddy, our previous speaker, talked about that. It's about recognising that actually, there's tough times in life, but also there's good times too, and it's really about being mindfully accepting those times. It's about enjoying them and trying to elongate them whenever they actually happen as well. When you meet those tough times, this therapy really tells you what you must do is you must act then in a committed way. And what is that committed way? Well, you commit to your values. And this is something, again, I think that young people, we very rarely think about what are our values. Now, when I talk to my kids about this, I'll say to them, so what do you want people to actually say about you on your 30th birthday if they were given a speech? Because I'm 46, I think to myself, what will people say about me when I'm dead? I suppose it depends on who's sitting around your bed. But what do you want them to say? And I say to them, for example, do you want them to say, well, she was an honest person. She acted with integrity. He was a committed environmentalist. He was a committed, loyal friend. He was always there to help. She was a tireless worker for charity and to doing good things. So those are those core things that you hold in the centre of your heart or your soul or whatever is it. Those are your values, whether it is even being a committed Christian and always trying to do everything in that way. So then all your actions in life actually should be around your values. So no matter what thing you face in life, What kind of a challenge? If you remain committed to your values, you always feel that you're making progress. So it's not about goals, it's not about getting the big house, it's not about getting married, it's knowing that every day you wake up and you keep working towards your values. And apparently when people start to take this direction in life, they find that the stress and the depression and the anxiety just starts to ease naturally, even though they're told, don't try and hide it and don't run away from it, just accept it. This is one of the things in life. There's downs as well as ups. So of course then I thought, this is really fantastic. There's a professional way to deal with this, and maybe I'm an economist. Can we apply this to our economy? Now there's a thought, and I thought, well, it wouldn't be obviously acceptance and commitment therapy. For economists, it would have to be acceptance and commitment theory. So you can't read this chart, but there was just a few bullet points on it as to how we could maybe look at this in terms of our economy and even our society as a whole. So, for example, in the economy, there's a lot of things that we just actually have to accept that we rarely talk about. And, you'll hear about jobs being lost in manufacturing, and we take the opportunity to knock the politicians over the head and say, well, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? But the reality is with any economy that there's always things outside of your control. So, for example, the financial crisis back in 2008, we certainly, in a small peripheral economy like Northern Ireland, we don't influence anything to do with international credit flows. Things like interest rates and exchange rates, even as a regional economy, we've no influence over the interest rates. Exchange rates, we can't help it when another country reduces their exchange rate, depreciates, and they become much more competitive for exports. Those are things we have to accept. And we have to accept that it will never be a bowl of cherries for the Northern Ireland economy. We will always face challenges. But that said, maybe we should think about what values should we continue to work at as an economy to move forward and to make sure that we're making progress. Now, those economic values, we don't talk about them. So in 2060, 2070, what do we want future generations to say about the policy leaders, the economic leaders, and the business community, etc., at the turn of the 21st century? So in my mind, for example, I would like them to say things like, well, they were really hard workers. They actually accepted that unless you work hard, you don't achieve great things. So they were really progressive and ambitious for what they wanted to do with their economy. They were collaborators. They worked from north to south, to east to west with their neighbours because they recognised if they collaborate, they will maximise the opportunities for everyone. They recognised that integration was actually necessary if they were going to maximise the benefits, the economic benefits for everyone. So they took steps and they took actions to make sure that full integration really happened amongst their children and amongst society as a whole. They were intolerant of inequality. They decided that they didn't want an economy where there was a huge discrepancy between people with the flashy cars and people lying on the streets. So they pushed the UK government perhaps to introduce an inequality index, so tax adjustments would be made whenever the inequality rose too high. They were very flexible people in their economy. They were able to scan the horizon and to look forward, and they were instantly reacted to what they thought was coming down the line. And they were prepared to take calculated risks, measured risks, to make sure that the economy did grow. And they didn't always beat people over the head whenever it didn't work out for them. And I think very importantly, I would hope in 2060, 2070, that they said, well, actually, in Northern Ireland, they recognised that they were in a really good place. They didn't give off. They actually recognised, relative to many other economies around the world, they had free education, they had a national health service. And they really thought about how this impacted upon other people, and they wanted to help other nations, and they reached out and they helped people, like people in the migrant crisis that happened around that time. Ladies and gentlemen, I think in Northern Ireland, we don't actually talk openly about what our values actually are. We don't question our politicians. What are your values and how do they sit with mine? We don't talk to our young people about their values and what's important to them, and the importance of making sure that they elect people who reflect their values so that society moves along with their values. I think that conversation should start in 2016. Thank you.